Coming up next on C-SPAN, we air an address by William Rusher, the publisher of the National Review. The title of his address before students at the University of Virginia is The Reagan Legacy.
William Rusher is our speaker this evening. He's a major architect of the conservative movement in the United States and a major spokesperson for the conservative viewpoint on public issues. He is a graduate of Princeton University and the Harvard Law School and spent 7 years in the litigation department of Sherman & Sterling in New York City. Since 1957, Mr. Rusher has been publisher of National Review, America's leading journal of conservative political thought. As a political activist, he was one of three involved in launching in 1961 the movement to draft Barry Goldwater for the 1964 Republican presidential nomination. That movement, of course, can be traced as the beginning of Ronald Reagan's political career. He's the author of 5 books and numerous articles. He is a syndicated columnist appearing twice weekly in over 200 newspapers. And he's also a familiar television and radio personality. For 4 years, he served as the conservative spokesman on The Advocates, the award-winning program on the public broadcasting service. He has been a regular commentator on the Westinghouse Broadcasting Network, on the Associated Press Radio Network, and appears regularly on public affairs programs. His topic today is the Reagan legacy in the future. We hope as well during the question and answer period he'll have an opportunity to comment on events that are very current. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to join me in welcoming this afternoon's speaker, William Rusher.
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I haven't been in Charlottesville in quite a while. In fact, Mr. Crouch asked me what the last time was. I couldn't even recall, but I know it was quite some time back. But there was a time when I was in Charlottesville quite a lot. When I was at Harvard Law School, my mother remarried a gentleman who lived in Charlottesville at that time, and such addresses I had in the world of a more than transient nature, I guess, was Charlottesville. And they later moved about 1950 to Harrisonburg and then on down to Miami in 1953. But for that period of the late 1940s, therefore, about 40 years ago, I knew Charlottesville and became very, very fond of it indeed. You're all obviously aware that I'm a conservative. So there won't be any surprises in that regard. Bill Buckley loves to tell the story of a fellow who had a terrible feud with his mother-in-law. A deep-dyed mutual animosity. And a sad day came when his wife lay in a mortal illness, and he was sitting by her bedside, and he said, "Dear, is there any last wish of yours that I can grant? Anything I can promise you that'll make you happy?" And she said, "Yes, John, there's one thing. I wish that on the day of my funeral you would ride in the car with my mother." He thought about it. Finally, he said, "Very well, dear, if you ask it, I'll promise it, but it'll ruin my day." I hope I don't ruin anybody's day. Next year, I will turn 65. And the only advantage I have thus far been able to discover of age is that it does lengthen your perspective, which is an interesting thing to have happen, because you see things in a little different relation to each other as the perspective lengthens. In the case of the subject this afternoon, the Reagan legacy, more broadly the conservative movement and beyond, looking back even 35 years ago, 36, 37, It could be said, in fact, Lionel Trilling did say, that liberalism was not only the dominant, but even the sole intellectual tradition in the United States, because he said there were no conservative ideas in general circulation. He was absolutely right. A few antiquarians here and there hung out in isolated enclaves in colleges or elsewhere, but essentially there was no communal movement, nothing like a body of opinion. All that has happened, remarkably enough, I think, in this last 35 years. There has pulled together a body of opinion, which we now denominate, it wasn't always so, conservatism, to distinguish it from the modern American liberalism, which of course is again highly distinguishable from the old 19th century classical liberalism growing out of the Enlightenment, with which conservatism has many things in common. The liberalism that we confronted in the early 1950s was, simply to borrow a phrase from Mao, the sea in which everybody swam. Most people weren't so much conscious of it as simply totally surrounded by it. Of course it dominated in the colleges. What else was there? There was no competition. Of course it dominated in journalism and in all intellectual fields. It was simply the ground of being, very nearly, for ideas in the America of the early 1950s. And politics always, as always, followed suit. Politics, I don't want to give away their secrets, but our leaders are not, of course, in most cases, leaders. They are followers, at the very best, crystallizers. Gandhi's old remark, "There go my followers, I must hurry to lead them," is right on the mark. And the politicians of that benighted age followed their followers, or led their followers. So that I've had the good fortune, because of the position, as you heard, I started as a lawyer and then turned to a life of crime and became a magazine publisher. And I've had the opportunity to watch the growth of this conservative movement into the rather large and elaborated and interesting and impressive and influential thing, I think, that it is today. It has been nothing less than the entire job of creating a new, and we think a better, understanding of the world. I don't mean for a moment that it was all original. We were drawing in every case, I think, on older traditions, on older categories of knowledge. We were drawing on the Judeo-Christian tradition and some of its social and political extrapolations. We were drawing on some of the insights of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, although with others we perhaps had our quarrels. And then all of these things were knitted together. I like to think, I darn well assert that National Review had something to do with that. Not I so much as the editors who wrote most of the things in it, who brought all of this into a cohesive, not always unified. Sometimes there was a lot of paradoxical tension involved, but no doubt about it, a single point of view that was then capable of being applied. As I said, an understanding of the world that was then capable of being applied to the events of the day, the days of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Simultaneously with the development of this critique, because that's what it amounted to, a critique of the liberal worldview and its consequences, we were watching, because it was dominant, the developing growth and results of liberalism. It was being acted out right under our noses and those of the liberals. And various things, some of them we had predicted, others perhaps we had not predicted quite so it clearly came to be the case. Government, far from being a fairy godmother who could solve all problems by waving her wand, turned out to be a highly incompetent mechanism for many, perhaps most purposes. I remember a time on the Advocates in the early 1970s when, and it was true of that program. I doubt many of you are old enough to remember it, but it was a program in which the proposition was always, should government do something? It was new. It had to be a governmental action proposition. I usually had the negative. And I would open up with some variant of the statement that the good people who have brought you Amtrak and the Postal Service and the swine flu program are now about to do something else for you, you know, and I had them right in the palm of my hand at that point. This concept of the, or understanding of the incompetence of government for many purposes got up there like Telstar. George Will objects to it. He says that we should respect government, that conservatism has made a big mistake to badmouth it so thoroughly. I disagree with him totally. The parts of the government that have to be good usually are good. The professional military at the higher levels. Have you ever noticed that the bureaucrat from whom you want something, a postal employee or even in any one of the departments, is often a very inefficient soul? But that isn't true of most internal revenue agents. When the government wants something of you, they can get somebody who's pretty good at getting it. And so I don't worry too much about their inefficiency in the places where, as I say, they must be, are supposed to be competent. But the incompetence of government slowly, I think, became apparent to most people in many fields during that whole period from the 50s through to the 80s. The sheer devastating consequences of liberalism became apparent, particularly in the later period. I've never thought that we conservatives would necessarily have gotten anywhere without the help of liberalism. We could have stood there and yelled that they were no damn good and nothing would have happened at all if they hadn't fallen apart on their own sweet basis right in front of our eyes. When you consider, and I will just mention it in passing illustratively, what liberalism and its sincere efforts to make things better have done to the black family in this country, you will understand, I hope, what I mean. I think they have, with the best of intentions, very nearly totally destroyed. And my authorities for that, by the way, are black economists who have studied the matter far more deeply than I have. And then lastly, at the purely intellectual level, we're beginning to see now the results, the devastating, the deadly results of the permanently open mind. Of course, what it results in is not an open mind at all, but a hermetically closed mind. Alan Bloom's book is the most recent statement of this particular case. I remember during the 1950s how truly committed liberals were to the open mind, or thought they were anyway, and I think they were. They were, as Bill Buckley said, they sincerely were committed to hearing the other point of view, even though they sometimes exhibited great shock on discovering that there really was another point of view. Alger Hiss had to be allowed to speak at Princeton because, you know, there was just no other way we could satisfy the demands of John Stuart Mill. Well, they didn't like him particularly, but they sat there, by golly, and listened to him. That was the open mind. The other day, the Harvard Law School Forum had Adolfo Calero. At least they started to. And some character from Tufts leaped up. You probably saw the picture in the papers, and yelled death to traitors or something like that, and Harvard canceled the entire appearance. That's what's happened to the open mind in America's colleges, many of them. And it may be, as somebody has said, that Bloom goes too far to analogize what is happening in the closing of the American mind to what happened in the German universities under Hitler. I'm not sure he does. It is really getting difficult, and has been since the Vietnam War, difficult for many people to speak on college campuses today. As far as I know, Jean Kirkpatrick doesn't much even try anymore. Her views being so outrageous that America's youth cannot be bothered, I guess, to listen to them. Well, these are some of the consequences of liberalism that have been apparent, not just to the conservatives, but I think to everybody, including many liberals. With predictably negative results. The politicians, once again, saw their followers and hurried to lead them. And so we developed, inevitably, a political conservative movement to follow. And that's the proper sequence, by the way, to follow the intellectual conservative movement. In the beginning is the Word. And after that come the people who will apply the ideas to the social and political affairs of the time. I mark the turn of the conservative movement actively into politics about 1960, 61, certainly was well underway by 62. Modesty will not quite prevent me from saying, if you're really interested in reading all about it, I did write a book on the subject called The Rise of the Right, in which I tried to tell the story which I had seen and participated in before history congealed in some other version. And I think I got there in time. It's still, with the exception of Sidney Blumenthal's The Rise of the Counter-Establishment, almost the only book that attempts to focus on the entire sweep of the period. The politicians followed suit. Ronald Reagan, as it happened before he became in any sense an active politician, became a subscriber to National Review in 1960 and was certainly a committed conservative, even movement conservative, within 4 or 5 years thereafter. I need not bore you with the story of the politics of these last 20 years, or 25. You know it as well as I do. I would simply observe this, that when at last conservatism became politically, undeniably, inescapably, not only a part of the American political scene, but a part of the, a dominant part of it. The first thing that the liberals did, not unreasonably, at least a lot of them, typified by Gary Hart in 1984, was go looking for new ideas. All right, those didn't work, we'll find some new ideas. Somebody wisecracked, the only 2 new ideas Gary Hart ever found were his name and his age. But the truth of the matter is that he had set himself a very difficult assignment. New ideas in politics, really new ideas at the profounder levels, are very hard to come by. In fact, Whittaker Chambers, in his book Witness, in that wonderful introduction to it, some of you may have read, defines 2 great alternative faiths of mankind as being the only 2 really we've got. You can take your pick. Anybody who comes up with a third is going to be quite a thinker. But the new ideas, therefore, the search for new ideas didn't work all that well. Somebody said, again, I hate to graze on Gary Hart, but it does come to mind. I think it was one of the New York newspapers, surely couldn't have been the Times, said that this year, whatever it was Gary Hart had, the idea certainly wasn't new. And I think the Democrats have now gotten away from the liberals, from looking for new ideas. The proposition seems to be that, all right, we'll go back to the old ideas. Time magazine has proclaimed that compassion is back. This isn't a new idea. This is the attempt to revive the old liberal claim of compassion and to make it a political, programmatic claim that the government will help the people who, in one way or another, cannot so well help themselves, and so on. My feeling about the competition, and it certainly will exist, I have no doubt that there's a certain amount of pendulum in human affairs, but I do think we have gotten somewhere besides. I don't think that things just swing back and forth monotonously through history. I think that we have achieved, at least for our time and the foreseeable future, some understandings of what does and doesn't work in human affairs that will stay with us. Certainly the creativity of the conservative movement is not yet exhausted, and its infrastructure is simply enormous. I don't think this is sufficiently taken into account by people who perhaps aren't as well positioned to see it as I am. Over most of the time that I've been around, until the early 1970s, there simply was no effective, regular funding of conservative activities. In terms of organized funding, compared to the Ford Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation and all the rest that were running the show for the liberals during the 1940s and 50s, we just weren't even in sight. We still aren't in sight, or at least we're just barely getting there with perhaps the Bradley Foundation, which is now one of the big foundations in America. But we now do have some serious funding of conservative causes in this country, and very well done and with the precision of a rifle shot in many cases. I have in mind the Olin Foundation, as I said, the Bradley Foundation just coming online, the Richardson Foundation, smaller but important, and various others that are not quite as large or important as those. So that it is possible now to find funding for conservative activities that deserve it. We have training schools of all sorts for young people, either professional associations like your Federalist Society and the law schools, or the National Journalism Training Center in Washington under Stan Evans, or the various schools for campaign managers, informal or otherwise, that have been run by Paul Weyrich and others. We have legal foundations like the Western States Legal Foundation, or the Rocky Mountain States Legal Foundation was the one that Jim Watt came out of, but then there's one in California. There are about 3 or 4 anyway, legal foundations in Washington testing conservative issues in the courts. The courts themselves, need I tell you, from time to time, improve a little bit here and there around the edges. And basically, I simply don't feel any longer in a position to complain about the size, the strength, or the quality of the conservative infrastructure in this country. Believe me, it can't be put out of business if the Republicans should lose in '88 or something like that, as they may or may not. It will be around. As a matter of fact, in many ways, as Blumenthal says at the end of his book, they would actually be glad if it did lose. The conservatives grew up in opposition, and they can go back there and be happy in it again. They know all about opposition. This business of being in power sometimes baffles them, but the business of being in opposition, they understand very well. So far as the liberals are concerned, quite obviously the left in its larger sense, the great alternative faith of mankind, is going to be around. But I've already indicated that I do not expect liberalism to come back in any strong way. We'll probably have more questions about this in the question period, which is coming up sooner than you think. But I don't think that whatever happens on Bork, which looks very negative at the moment, the liberals can possibly hang on to their control, very narrow control of the Supreme Court. If Reagan presses, as I'm sure he will, an alternative on them. So that whatever you think has been accomplished by this particular battle, I don't think the control of the court for the foreseeable future has been accomplished by it or preserved by it. A word finally about President Reagan, whom I've had the privilege of knowing personally since, I guess, not long after he became governor of California. My way having been paved by the fact that he was a National Review subscriber and glad to see me, that kind of thing. Right now, I am having a fair amount of difficulty even with my own editors at National Review. They are a fractious bunch. And they are feeling, many of them, in many respects, let down by Mr. Reagan. As Joe Sobran, one of the best writers among them, said recently, concluding one column, "Let someone else be Reagan." I am much more forgiving, and I brood about why, and I think there are several reasons which might be useful in understanding me or even in understanding Reagan for you to know. Number one is that, as I said, I'm older than most of them, and I can remember back to the Nixon and Eisenhower days when there was no conservative movement, and as far as Mr. Eisenhower was concerned, not about to be any. I was told that Leonard Hall, chairman of the Republican National Committee, bet somebody $100, which was a fair amount of money in those days, that he could get a given person into the Department of State, and failed and paid the bet. That, I don't know, maybe there was a reason in that particular case, but one would think that the Republican National Chairman ought, in a well-designed administration, to be able to do a little better than that. So that, to me, Ronald Reagan represents an infinite improvement over anything that has gone before. I remember early in his administration, when things were not going well, a lot of the early appointments, particularly at the cabinet level, were of old-timers who had had jobs under Nixon. And as we now see in retrospect, we gave Reagan no one else to choose from. There was nobody in the conservative movement who ever had any experience in government. He simply had to choose Republicans from the Nixon administration. But we did finally, as a result of Lynn Nossiger's little rebellion in the kitchen cabinet and so on, about February 1981, get a few people in. And I was saying to a friend of mine in Washington, a witty observer of the scene, I said, "You know, Neil, we must have a mole in the Reagan White House. We conservatives." He said, "We do, Bill. We have a mole in the Reagan White House. You know who it is? It's Reagan." And I'm inclined to think it's the case. I think that of all the people there, he is the one who tends, over the longest period of time, to keep his eye most steadily on the ball. The other thing I say about him is that, unlike, if I may say so, the editors of National Review, or indeed most writers, he lives in the real world. Ronald Reagan every day gets up confronted by people who certainly don't intend that he shall succeed, and by a world that doesn't straighten it out according to his desires, and without the power, no matter what you hear about the presidency, to just wave a wand and make everything go his way. And what's more, he knows this. A great many of these people, the people who condemn him, I think, don't know this. They think that, my Lord, here we are 6.5 years into the Reagan administration, and there are still liberals in Washington. And of course there are, and very influential ones too. And there will be after Reagan is gone. The world does not sort itself out that easily. I think Reagan has done prodigies. I think that most of the people who now condemn him will spend the rest of their lives looking back on his administration as the golden age. But at the same time, as I said, there is a forward motion here, no question about it. The movement is stronger because of his administration. All of the troops that have been blooded by jobs in it are there and will continue to be there. And so that the Reagan legacy, in both terms of ideas and in terms of personnel, is simply enormous. Simply enormous. I have concluded the remarks that I prepared for you, and I did prepare them for you, which explains why this talk has perhaps been a little more disjointed than one that I have seamlessly delivered 100 times. I apologize if you have found it so. But I would like to leave one thought with you that I have certainly left with many an audience. I said at the beginning that what the conservatives did was create an entire new, and we felt better, way of looking at the world, or discover one, because we did not so much create as go back to previous sources. And if it is better only because it is more accurate. Mankind has many ways to kid himself. In a democracy, the fellow who claims that 2 and 2 make 4 is at various sorts of disadvantage over against the really articulate young fellow who can persuade an audience that he can make it equal 22. But of course you and I know, and it doesn't even matter whether we know, does it, in the long run, that 2 and 2 do make 4. And what we try to do in the conservative movement is place our bets where the facts are, even if over the short term you do suffer, and you do, certain political disadvantages. I noticed throughout the liberal heyday the sheer eclecticism of liberalism. They didn't care where their ideas came from, what the provenance was, or indeed where they went afterward, as long as they worked. They would take the best of liberalism and the best of Marxism and the best of Christianity and wrap them all into some little bouquet that might get them past the next presidential election. And often did, by substantial margins. But when you live by that kind of evanescence, eventually you die by it. And I think that's what has happened to them. We conservatives like to take our stand with the 19th century poet Coventry Patmore, who wrote a little quatrain with which I will close. I like it very well. I find it very reassuring. Maybe you will. For want of me, the world's course will not fail. When all its work is done, the lie shall rot. The truth is great and shall prevail when none cares whether it prevail or not. Thank you.
Join C